The snow was falling softly outside, covering the backyard with a pure white blanket. In the living room, the glow of the Christmas lights reflected off the windows, creating a display of dancing colors. Clara, 10 years old, was lying on the couch, holding a Christmas storybook. Her parents were in the kitchen, finishing the preparations for dinner, and her older brother, Lucas, was messing with his phone, oblivious to the world around him. "It's almost midnight," Clara thought, glancing at the clock on the wall. The excitement of Santa's arrival kept her awake. But there was something different about this Christmas Eve, something she couldn't explain. That's when she heard the first sound, a jingle of bells, but not the cheerful bells from Christmas songs. These bells had a dragging sound, with a deep and strange echo. Clara sat up, furrowing her brow. "Did you hear that?" she asked her brother. Lucas didn't take his eyes off his phone. "Hear what?" Before Clara could answer, a movement caught her attention at the window. Something big and dark passed quickly by the glass, disappearing as fast as it had appeared. Her heart raced. "There's something outside," she whispered, but Lucas just groaned. "It's probably the wind. Go to sleep, Clara." But Clara knew it wasn't the wind. She walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain. The backyard seemed empty, except for a distant figure near the tallest tree. It was hard to make out details, but the shape seemed familiar, and yet wrong. A solid figure, wearing something that looked like a tattered red coat, was standing still. Clara tried to focus better, but the figure's eyes, or where the eyes should have been, were just dark, empty holes. She took a step back, bumping into the lamp beside her. The noise made the figure move for the first time, not walking but gliding, as if it wasn't touching the ground. Clara screamed, and Lucas finally looked up from his phone. "What now?" he asked, clearly annoyed. "There's someone out there," she exclaimed, pointing at the window. Lucas went over to check, but when he looked, there was nothing but the snow-covered backyard. "You're imagining things. Go to sleep." Seriously. But Clara knew what she'd seen, and as she lay back down on the couch, her mind couldn't forget those empty eyes or the sound of the bells that still seemed to echo in the distance. In the kitchen, the sound of her parents' laughter seemed a little off. "Good night, little Clara," murmured a deep, distorted voice, one she couldn't place. And with that, the night before Christmas began to turn into a nightmare. The night was quieter than it should have been. Even though the clock showed it was almost midnight, Clara couldn't seem to close her eyes. The image of that figure gliding across the backyard haunted her every time she shut her eyelids. In an attempt to distract herself, she pulled the blanket up to her chin and tried to focus on the comforting crackle of the fireplace in the living room. That's when she heard the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. At first, she thought it was Lucas coming up the stairs, but when she glanced at the door leading to the hallway, she noticed the light was off. Lucas should have been in his room by now. Her parents had also gone to bed after wishing Clara good night and reminding her to leave cookies and milk for Santa. The sound came again, a slow, rhythmic dragging, like something was being pulled down the hallway. "Lucas?" she called, her voice trembling more than she wanted it to. No answer. She got off the couch, feeling the cold wooden floor beneath her bare feet, and walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier, as though the very air in the house had become thick and oppressive. When she reached the doorway, she stopped. In the darkness of the hallway, something moved. Clara held her breath. The dim light from the lamp in the living room barely illuminated the hallway, but it was enough for her to make out the shape that was approaching. It was big, taller and broader than anyone in the house. The figure was wearing a dirty, torn red coat, stained with dark patches that looked like blood. But the most disturbing thing was the arms. They were far too long, disproportionate, with hands that scraped the walls as the figure moved. Clara wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The creature stopped just a few feet from her, tilting its head in a way that seemed almost curious. That's when she saw its face more clearly. It wasn't the Santa she knew. The beard was gray and untidy, partially covering a mouth that stretched unnaturally, revealing sharp, thin teeth. The eyes were empty, hollow, yet they seemed to stare right through her, piercing her soul. "Have you been a good girl this year, Clara?" asked the creature, its voice echoing as if it came from multiple places at once. She tried to respond, but no sound came from her mouth. The figure took a step forward, and Clara instinctively backed away, tripping and falling onto the cold floor. The creature's hands began to stretch toward her when a sharp sound broke the silence. Lucas's phone ringing upstairs. The creature stopped, its empty gaze shifting upward as if the sound had disturbed its purpose. In a swift, almost unreal movement, it vanished into the darkness of the hallway, leaving Clara alone, trembling and unable to move. For several minutes, she stood there, frozen, listening to the sound of Lucas's phone being silenced and the silence gradually returning to the house. When she finally managed to stand up, her feet hesitated before taking a step. Was it real? She whispered to herself. The hallway seemed empty now, but the metallic scent that lingered in the air, mixed with something rotten, told her otherwise. Clara ran to her parents' room, her heart racing. She entered without knocking, but stopped abruptly. Both of them were lying still, their eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. "Dad? Mom?" No response. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her chest tightening. The moonlight filtered through the window, partially illuminating their faces. They looked strangely serene, but something was wrong. Their eyes were open but empty, as if they were staring at something far beyond the ceiling. She approached slowly, calling them with a trembling voice. "Dad? Mom?" When she touched her father's arm, his body was cold, frozen like the ice outside. His hand fell from the bed with a dull thud, but he didn't react. Clara stifled a scream, her eyes filling with tears. She ran to her brother's room. The door was ajar, and Clara pushed it open slowly. The room was shrouded in darkness, except for a small blue light coming from Lucas's phone, still on his desk. But the bed was empty. "Lucas," she called, but the only response was the sound of the wind howling against the window. Desperate, Clara ran back to the living room. The place felt different now, colder, darker. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered erratically, as if controlled by some invisible presence. That's when she saw the notes. They were hanging from the tree's branches, written on old pieces of paper, like makeshift ornaments. Clara hesitated before approaching, grabbing the first note. "Have you been good enough?" Her hands trembled as she read the words. There was something terribly wrong with the handwriting. The letters looked scratched, as if they'd been made by nails instead of a pen. She grabbed another note. "I've already started collecting." A deep, distorted laugh filled the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Clara spun on her heels, searching for the source of the sound, but she was alone. The next message was attached to one of the presents under the tree. Clara knelt down, pulling the paper with trembling hands. "Do you know your family's secret?" She frowned. Secret? Fear and confusion gave way to a spark of determination. Something was happening to her family, something she needed to understand in order to save them. She remembered a locked drawer in her father's desk where he kept old, important papers. Clara ran to the office. The drawer key was in the pocket of the coat he always left hanging behind the door. With nervous fingers, she unlocked the drawer and began rifling through the papers. Among bills and documents, she found an old, yellowed photograph. It was a Christmas picture, but the faces weren't of her family. A burly man with a thick beard and a sinister smile was surrounded by children who didn't look happy. Their eyes filled with fear, their smiles forced. On the back of the photo, a hastily scribbled message read, "He always comes back at Christmas. Never open the door for him." Clara froze. The words hammered in her mind as the demonic laughter echoed through the house once more. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the living room was bathed in a red glow. Clara heard heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. They weren't Lucas's footsteps. They were his. The footsteps echoed down the hallway like drum beats, rhythmic and threatening. Clara froze, gripping the photo so tightly her fingers began to ache. The red light that filled the house seemed to pulse, like a dark heartbeat. "Lucas?" she dared to call, even though she knew it wasn't him. The response came in the form of a sharp crack, like wood splitting, followed by a sound that resembled a muffled laugh. Slowly, Clara peeked around the office doorway, only to see the empty hallway, except for something strange on the floor, a small package wrapped in dark red paper. Clara approached hesitantly, each step bringing the eerie sensation that something was watching her. When she picked up the package, she noticed it was icy cold, so cold it burned her skin. She untied the ribbon slowly and found inside Lucas's cap. "What's happening?" she whispered, tears beginning to roll down her face. She pressed the cap to her chest and ran back to the living room. She needed a plan. She needed to think. But when she got there, everything was different. The tree lights were completely off, and the room was immersed in shifting shadows that twisted along the walls as if they had a life of their own. On the coffee table, where the cookies for Santa had once been, there was a new note. "I've taken one. You'll be next if you're not smart." Fear turned to desperation. Clara knew she needed to save Lucas, but she also felt like time was running out. Then she noticed something new, a black mark on the floor, like a trail of soot leading to the back door. She followed it, her heart pounding in her chest. When she opened the door, Clara expected to see the snow-covered backyard, but what she found was something entirely different. The backyard had transformed into a dark void, a kind of opaque mist that swallowed everything around it. In the middle of this nothingness, a tall, hunched figure stood with its back to her. The robust silhouette and the tattered red coat were unmistakable. "Give my brother back," Clara screamed, her voice sounding braver than she felt. The creature slowly turned, revealing its empty eyes that glowed with a ghostly light. It opened its mouth, exposing those sharp teeth, and a guttural voice filled the air. He was chosen, just like the others before him. Clara took a step back, but something in the creature's words paralyzed her. "Others before him? What do you mean?" The creature laughed, a sound so dark it made the snow around it melt. "Your father knew. He tried to escape, but no one escapes me. Every Christmas, I come to claim what belongs to me." Clara clenched her fists, her mind racing. "If that's what you want, why not just take me? Why hurt my family?" The creature's smile widened, distorting its monstrous face even further. Because fear adds flavor to the souls. Before Clara could react, the creature vanished into a cloud of shadows. The mist around her began to dissipate, and she realized she was back in the backyard, alone. But as she looked down at the snow beneath her feet, she saw footprints. Small footprints that led away from the house and disappeared toward the woods. "Lucas!" she shouted again, running back inside. She needed to prepare. Something told her that if she wanted to save him, she would have to confront the Shadow Santa on his own turf. As she closed the door behind her, a new laugh echoed through the house. This time, she was sure. It came from upstairs, from her parents' bedroom. Clara hesitated as she climbed the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The laugh she'd heard moments before had already faded, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The hallway seemed longer than usual, as if the house was warped by the presence of that thing. When she reached the door to her parents' room, she found it ajar. The light from the lamp beside the bed flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Her parents were still lying there, motionless, their eyes fixed on the ceiling. Clara approached, calling them once more, but like before, there was no response. Then she noticed something strange on the nightstand beside her mother, a small key with a snowflake ornament on top. Next to the key, there was a yellowed envelope with her name written by hand. "Why is this here?" Clara thought, trembling as she picked up the envelope. Inside, there was a short letter written hastily. "Clara, if you're reading this, something went wrong. I tried to protect him, but he's back. Go to the basement. The answer is there. Dad. A chill ran down Clara's spine. The basement was the one place in the house she had never explored. Her father always said it was just a storage space, but now she knew there was more. She grabbed the key and descended the stairs, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the silent house. When she reached the basement, she hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. A musty, damp, metallic smell hit her nose as soon as the door creaked open. The wooden staircase leading down seemed endless. With a flashlight in her hand, Clara descended, illuminating the path ahead. The stone walls were covered with ancient marks, like symbols she didn't recognize. At the center of the basement, there was a table. On it, a dark wooden box with the same snowflake ornament carved on the lid. Clara carefully opened the box and found a diary inside, along with a small, worn golden bell. She opened the diary, and the first pages revealed something that made her heart race. It was the story of her family, but not the version she knew. Decades ago, her great-grandfather had made a pact with something called the Collector of Shadows, an entity that promised prosperity and luck in exchange for a soul every generation. Clara's great-grandfather, desperate to save his farm during tough times, had accepted the deal, believing he could trick the entity when the time came. But no one could deceive the Collector. Every Christmas, it returned to collect what was owed, always seeking children, the purest and most valuable of souls. The generations that followed had tried to break the pact, but none succeeded. Now, it seemed that it was Lucas's turn. Clara flipped through the pages quickly, searching for a solution. At the end of the diary, there were instructions for a ritual that could temporarily stop the entity. It was dangerous, required courage, and sacrifice. Clara, she froze, feeling the blood run cold in her veins. The voice was familiar, but strangely distorted. Lucas, she called, spinning around. At the foot of the stairs stood a figure, but it wasn't her brother. It was the Shadow Santa, holding Lucas's hat in one of its twisted hands. It grinned, revealing sharp teeth, and took a step forward. Time is running out, girl. Decide quickly. Surrender, or he will be mine forever. Clara swallowed hard, clutching the diary and the golden bell with all the strength she had. She knew what she needed to do. You won't take my brother, she whispered, feeling a surge of courage rise in her chest. The creature tilted its head, intrigued, as Clara prepared for the next step, one that would decide the fate of both her and Lucas. The silence that followed felt as dense as the darkness around her. Clara stared at the Santa Claus of shadows, feeling the weight of the diary in her hands and the cold bell pressed against her palm. The creature, now illuminated by the faint light of the lantern, seemed bigger and more grotesque. Its empty eyes pulsed with a ghostly glow, and the laugh that followed sounded like thunder. You have courage, girl, but courage isn't enough to fool the shadows. Clara clenched her fists, taking a deep breath to steady the trembling in her hands. She knew time was running out. She needed to act fast. With the diary open, she began reading the instructions for the ritual. The words were written in an ancient language, but there were translated notes in the margins, left by her ancestors. To stop the Collector, ring the bell to summon him into the circle. The sacrifice will determine the outcome. Her eyes locked on the word sacrifice, but she pushed the fear aside. She couldn't think about that now. Using the chalk she found in the box, Clara drew a circle on the floor of the basement, exactly as shown in the diary. The markings on the floor began to glow faintly, as if responding to her presence. This is foolishness, the creature sneered, watching her with contempt. Do you really believe you can stop me? Generations before you tried and failed. Clara didn't respond. She picked up the bell and raised it, feeling it vibrate with strange energy. With a firm motion, she shook it. The sound that came out wasn't what she expected. It was deep and guttural, like the roar of thunder in a distant cave. The Santa Claus of shadows stopped. Its empty eyes glowed brightly, and it let out a deafening scream. The ground began to tremble, and the shadows around seemed to condense, sucked into the circle. "You dare challenge me," it roared, trying to advance but stopped by the now brightly glowing edges of the circle. Clara held the bell tightly as she read the final words of the ritual aloud, each syllable sliced through the air like blades. The creature writhed, its form becoming more distorted, as if being torn apart from the inside. But then, something unexpected happened. The circle's glow began to fade. The bell in her hand grew heavier, almost impossible to hold. The creature, sensing Clara's hesitation, grinned widely. "You're not willing to pay the price, are you?" it taunted. "Without a sacrifice, the ritual fails. You knew that." Clara swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she held the diary and the bell. Sacrifice. The word echoed in her mind. She knew what it meant, but she was willing to do anything to save Lucas. "Take me," she said finally, her voice steady. The Santa Claus of Shadows stopped, tilting its head as if it didn't understand. "I said, take me," Clara shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Leave Lucas and my family alone. You want a soul? Take mine." The creature let out a guttural laugh. "So selfless, little Clara. But I accept." The circle glowed one final, intense flash, and the creature advanced, its deformed hands reaching toward Clara. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the creature's cold touch, but instead she heard a deafening scream. When she opened her eyes, the creature was dissolving into shadows, being sucked into the circle. Its face twisted in anger and surprise as it disappeared completely, leaving only the echo of its laughter in the air. The circle faded, and the basement fell into complete silence. Clara collapsed to her knees, exhausted and in tears. "Clara," Lucas's soft voice made her lift her head. He was standing at the top of the stairs, holding the cap in his hand, a confused look on his face. "Lucas," she screamed, running to embrace him. He seemed confused but healthy, as though nothing had happened. "What's going on? I heard a noise and... Are you okay?" Clara cupped his face in her hands, relieved to have him there. "It's okay now," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure it was true. As Clara climbed the stairs with Lucas, the silence in the house felt almost deafening. The absence of the distorted laughter and heavy footsteps of the Santa Claus of Shadows should have been a relief, but something didn't feel right. "Are you really okay, Lucas?" she asked as he climbed ahead of her. "Yeah, I think so." He frowned, touching the cap. "But I remember being in a strange place. It was dark, like a bad dream." Clara clenched her fists, still holding the diary. She wanted to believe everything was over, but a part of her knew the battle wasn't fully won. The sacrifice she had offered seemed not to have been completely accepted, which meant something else was still coming. Back in the living room, Clara noticed that her parents were still lying down motionless, with their eyes fixed on the ceiling. Despite the apparent calm, the atmosphere was still heavy. "Lucas, stay here. I'll see what I can do for them," she said, walking toward her parents' bedroom. But as soon as she crossed the threshold of the door, she heard a terrible sound behind her, a loud thud, followed by Lucas's scream. "Clara!" She spun around quickly, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. In the room, Lucas was being dragged by something that had emerged from the shadows. It was no longer the Santa Claus of Shadows, but a fragmented version of it, made of pure darkness, with extended claws. Clara ran toward Lucas, but was repelled by an invisible force. She fell onto her back, the diary flying from her hands. The creature's voice echoed, now sharper and more desperate. "You thought you could rid yourself of me so easily? I am the shadow of every broken promise, of every forgotten sin. There is no escape." Lucas was being dragged toward the darkest corner of the room, and Clara knew she needed to act immediately. The bell. She searched frantically and found it lying near the fireplace. Without hesitation, she grabbed the bell and shook it again, but this time the sound was weaker, less powerful. The ritual had been weakened. "You don't have enough strength, child," mocked the creature, its form growing, swallowing almost the entire room. Clara looked around desperately until her eyes fixed on the Christmas tree. Among the branches, the glow of a golden star caught her attention. It wasn't a regular ornament. It was something her father always placed at the top of the tree. Something special. "Please let this work," she murmured, rushing toward the tree. She grabbed the star and felt a wave of warmth course through her body. As soon as she held the object, a golden light radiated through the room, momentarily pushing the shadows back. The creature screamed, recoiling, but didn't disappear completely. "You think a simple light can stop what I am? I am eternal." Clara raised the star, pointing it directly at the creature. "You may be eternal, but you don't belong in this house. You don't belong to us." With all the strength she had left, she threw the star toward the creature. As soon as the light touched the darkness, a blinding glow filled the room, so intense that Clara had to close her eyes. The creature's scream was the last thing she heard before silence took over once again. When she opened her eyes, the room was back to normal. The lights on the tree flickered softly, and the oppressive presence had vanished. Lucas was sitting on the floor, trembling but safe. Clara ran to him, hugging him tightly. "It's okay now, Lucas. It's okay," she whispered, even though she wasn't entirely sure. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was exactly midnight. Sunlight streamed through the house's windows, casting a soft glow across the room. Clara opened her eyes, feeling her body heavy, as if she had been running for hours. She was still on the floor beside Lucas, who was sleeping against the couch. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but the memory of the previous night quickly returned like an overwhelming wave. She looked around, expecting to find some trace of the creature, but the house was quiet. The Christmas tree lights still blinked, but with a calm and reassuring rhythm. The golden star, which had been used to defeat the Santa Claus of shadows, was no longer at the top of the tree or anywhere else. Clara carefully got up, her body protesting with every movement. The parents. She rushed to their bedroom, her heart heavy with worry. When she opened the door, she found them sitting on the bed, blinking as though they had just woken from a deep sleep. "Clara," her mother called, confused. "What's going on? Why are we?" Before she could finish, Clara ran to embrace them, tears streaming down her face. "You're okay. You're here." Her parents looked at each other, puzzled, but returned the hug. "Of course we are, darling. What happened?" Clara hesitated. How could she explain everything? Would they believe her? She decided that, in that moment, the most important thing was that they were all alive and together. Later, as they sat down for Christmas breakfast, Clara noticed that Lucas was quiet. He was fiddling with the leftover cookies from the night before, his expression thoughtful. "Lucas, are you okay?" she asked, placing her hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her, furrowing his brow. "I remember something from the place I was. It was dark, but there were voices. They were talking about you, Clara." "About me?" Lucas nodded, looking at the ground. "They said you were different, that you were the only one who could break the cycle." Clara fell silent, his words echoing in her mind. The diary had mentioned that no one before her had managed to stop the collector. Had she truly broken the cycle, or had she only delayed the inevitable? As she thought, a soft sound caught her attention, a bell ringing in the distance. She looked out the window, but everything outside seemed normal. The backyard covered in snow, the morning light illuminating the landscape. Still, a chill ran down her spine. "Clara," her father called. "Are you okay?" She forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." The rest of the day passed quietly. They exchanged gifts, laughed, and pretended it was just another ordinary Christmas. But Clara knew something had changed. That night, while everyone slept, she returned to the basement. The wooden box was still there, with the diary inside. When she opened the book, she noticed that the final pages, once filled with old notes, were now blank. except for a sentence written in the center of the last page. He always comes back. Clara closed the diary, holding it tightly against her chest. She didn't know when or how, but she was certain that this Christmas would not be the last confrontation. For now, her family was safe, and that was enough